The morning of March 15th, 2023, started like any other day at Buckingham Palace. Margaret Thompson, the head of palace security, walked through the marble corridors with her usual confidence. She had been protecting the royal family's treasures for over 20 years. Nothing ever surprised her anymore, or so she thought. Margaret's black shoes clicked against the polished floors as she made her way to the underground vaults. Every Tuesday morning, she performed the same routine security check. The heavy metal door to the royal treasury stood before her, just as it had for decades. She entered the security code that only 5 people in the world knew. The massive vault door slowly opened with a deep mechanical sound. Cool air rushed out, carrying the scent of old metal and precious stones. Margaret stepped inside, expecting to see the familiar glint of gold and jewels under the bright lights. But something was terribly wrong. The glass case in the center of the room stood empty. The velvet cushion where the St. Edward's crown should have rested was bare. Margaret's heart began to race. She blinked several times, hoping her eyes were playing tricks on her. The crown, worth over £40 million and worn by kings and queens for centuries, had vanished. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her radio. "Code red in the treasury," she whispered into the device. "I repeat, code red in the treasury." Within minutes, the quiet palace transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Security guards rushed through the halls, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Detective Chief Inspector James Morrison arrived within an hour. He was a tall man with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had solved many cases in his 30-year career, but nothing like this. As he stood in the empty vault, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. "When was the crown last seen?" Morrison asked Margaret, who was still pale from the shock. "Friday afternoon," she replied, checking her logbook with trembling fingers. "The viewing was for the French ambassador and his wife. Everything was normal then." Morrison examined the vault carefully. There were no signs of forced entry. The security cameras showed nothing unusual. The electronic locks had not been tampered with. It was as if the crown had simply disappeared into thin air. The news could not be kept secret for long. By evening, reporters gathered outside the palace gates like hungry wolves. The story spread across the world faster than wildfire. "Royal crown stolen," screamed the headlines. "Palace security failed," declared others. Inside the palace, meetings continued late into the night. The Queen's private secretary, Sir David Williams, paced back and forth in his office. He had served the royal family for 40 years and had never faced such a crisis. Phone calls came in from government ministers, foreign ambassadors, and insurance companies. How could this happen? Sir David asked himself over and over again. The crown was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of British history, worn by monarchs since the 1600s. The original crown had been destroyed during the English Civil War, but the current one had been made for King Charles II in 1661. Detective Morrison worked through the night, interviewing everyone who had access to the vault. The list was short, but included some of the most trusted people in Britain. There was Margaret Thompson, the security chief, Professor Alan Hayes, the royal historian who catalogued the treasures, Sarah Chen, the conservator who cleaned and maintained the crown jewels, Thomas Wright, the master jeweler who performed repairs, and finally, Lord Edward Pemberton, the keeper of the royal collection. Each person had been thoroughly background checked before getting their position. They had all signed documents promising to protect the royal treasures with their lives. None of them had any obvious motive to steal the crown. As Morrison questioned each suspect, he noticed something strange. Everyone seemed genuinely shocked by the theft, but there was something else in their eyes. It looked almost like relief, as if a terrible secret had finally come to light. Professor Hayes, a nervous man in his 60s, kept adjusting his glasses as Morrison questioned him. "I've been studying the crown jewels for 20 years, he said. "I would never do anything to harm them. They are my life's work." Sarah Chen, A quiet woman in her 40s spoke in barely a whisper. "I've touched that crown hundreds of times," she said. "I know every gem, every curve of the metal. It's like losing a child." Thomas Wright, the master jeweler, was the most defensive. "I've repaired that crown twice in the past 5 years," he said angrily. "Why would I steal something I've spent so much time protecting?" Lord Pemberton, an elderly man with white hair and a stern face, said very little during his interview. He had been the keeper of the royal collection for over 30 years. His family had served the crown for generations. "This is impossible," was all he would say. Morrison left the palace that night with more questions than answers. As he drove through the dark streets of London, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was hiding something important. The next morning brought even more chaos. Newspaper reporters camped outside the homes of all the vault workers. Television crews broadcast live from outside the palace. The Prime Minister called an emergency meeting with palace officials. Inside the palace, the investigation continued. Morrison's team examined every inch of the vault with special equipment. They checked for secret passages, hidden panels, and any other way the crown could have been removed. They found nothing. The security footage was analyzed frame by frame. Hundreds of hours of recordings were reviewed by experts. The cameras showed people entering and leaving the vault area, but nothing suspicious. It was as if the crown had been there one day and gone the next. Meanwhile, international police agencies were alerted. Art theft experts from around the world offered their help. The crown was too famous to be sold openly, but it could be broken down and the individual gems sold separately. The thought made everyone at the palace sick. By the third day, pressure from the media and government was becoming unbearable. Sir David Williams held a press conference, his usually calm voice shaking slightly as he read from prepared notes. "The palace is working closely with law enforcement," he announced to the crowd of reporters. "We are confident that the crown will be recovered quickly. Security measures are being reviewed and strengthened." But privately, palace officials were beginning to panic. How could they explain that one of Britain's most precious treasures had simply vanished? How could they face the Queen and tell her that centuries of history had been lost on their watch? Detective Morrison continued his investigation with growing frustration. Every lead seemed to disappear as quickly as it appeared. The theft was too clean, too perfect. It had to be an inside job, but all the evidence pointed to innocent people who loved the crown jewels as much as the royal family did. As the first week ended, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He decided to dig deeper into the history of the crown itself. Perhaps the answer lay not in who had stolen it, but in the crown's own mysterious past. Late one evening, Morrison sat in the palace library, surrounded by old books and documents. He had been reading about the crown's history for hours. The crown had been made for King Charles II, but there were strange gaps in its record. There were years when no one seemed to know where it was, times when it disappeared from official documents only to reappear later. Morrison found references to special circumstances and necessary precautions in letters between palace officials from different eras. The language was careful, as if the writers were afraid to say too much. It was the same kind of careful language he had heard from the vault workers during his interviews. As Morrison read by lamplight, he began to suspect that the crown's disappearance might not be the first time it had vanished. Perhaps there was a pattern here, a secret that had been kept for generations. But if that was true, then who was keeping the secret, and why? The clock struck midnight as Morrison closed the last book. Tomorrow he would begin asking different questions. Instead of focusing on who had stolen the crown, he would ask whether the crown had really been stolen at all. Perhaps the real mystery was not where the crown had gone, but where it had been all along. Outside the palace windows, London slept uneasily. Somewhere in the darkness, the truth about the missing crown waited to be discovered. But Morrison had the feeling that when he finally found it, the truth would be more shocking than anyone could imagine. Detective Morrison arrived at the palace the next morning with a new strategy. Instead of treating this as a simple theft, he decided to investigate the Crown's entire history. He requested access to archives that hadn't been opened in decades. The palace archivist, Mrs. Eleanor Foster, was a small woman in her 70s who had worked in the royal archives for 50 years. She led Morrison through narrow corridors lined with filing cabinets and old wooden boxes. The air smelled of dust and old paper. "I've never had anyone ask for these particular files before," Mrs. Foster said as she pulled out a heavy leather box marked with the royal seal. "These documents go back to the 1940s. Morrison opened the box carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, reports, and official documents. As he read through them, a pattern began to emerge. During World War II, many royal treasures had been moved to secret locations for safety, but the records about the Crown were strangely incomplete. "Mrs. Foster," Morrison said, looking up from a yellowed letter, "do you know anything about Operation Safeguard?" The elderly woman's face went pale. She looked around nervously, even though they were alone in the archive room. "I'm not sure I should talk about that," she whispered. "Mrs. Foster, a priceless crown has disappeared. I need to know everything." She sat down heavily in an old chair, her hands shaking slightly. Operation Safeguard was a secret program during the war. When the Germans were bombing London, King George VI ordered that the most important treasures be hidden, not just moved, but truly hidden where no one could find them. Morrison leaned forward. "Hidden where?" "That's just it," Mrs. Foster said. "Only a few people knew the real locations: the king, his private secretary, and the head of security. They created fake records to confuse anyone who might try to find the treasures. Even palace staff believed the crown jewels were in one place when they were actually somewhere completely different." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "What happened after the war?" "The treasures were supposed to be returned to their proper places," Mrs. Foster explained. "But the war changed everything. The king died, staff changed, and some secrets died with the people who kept them. There were rumors that not everything was found." She pulled out another document from the bottom of the box. It was a letter dated 1952, written in careful handwriting. Morrison read it aloud. "It is our solemn duty to maintain the deception for the protection of the realm. The substitution must remain secret until such time as the true danger has passed. Only then may the original be restored to its rightful place." "Substitution?" Morrison said, looking at Mrs. Foster. "Are you telling me that the crown in the vault might have been a fake all along?" Mrs. Foster nodded slowly. "There were always whispers among the older staff. Some said the real crown never came back from its wartime hiding place. They said what people saw in the vault was a perfect copy, made to fool everyone." Morrison's mind raced. If this was true, then no one had stolen anything. The real question was, where was the authentic crown, and who had been protecting this secret for over 70 years? He spent the rest of the morning reading through more documents. A picture began to form of a secret organization within the palace itself. A group of trusted individuals who had kept the deception alive for decades, passing the secret from one generation to the next. Morrison found references to the Guardians in several documents. These were palace insiders who knew the truth about the hidden treasures. They had taken an oath to protect the secret, even from other members of the royal household. But something had gone wrong. Someone had removed the fake crown from the vault. Either the Guardians themselves had done it, or someone had discovered their secret and was threatening to expose them. Morrison decided to interview the vault workers again, but this time he would ask different questions. He started with Professor Hayes, the royal historian. "Professor," Morrison said as they sat in a quiet office, "I need to ask you about Operation Safeguard." Professor Hayes's face went white. He removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice shook. I think you do. I think you're one of the Guardians. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Morrison with tired eyes. How did you find out? The archives. Mrs. Foster helped me understand what really happened during the war. The question is, where is the real crown now? Professor Hayes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, tourists were taking pictures of the palace, unaware of the drama happening inside. My grandfather was one of the original Guardians, he said finally. He told my father the secret on his deathbed, and my father told me. We've been protecting the crown for 3 generations. Protecting it from what? From being stolen, from being damaged in wars or terrorist attacks, from being used by people who might harm the royal family. The real crown is safe, Mr. Morrison. It's been safe for 70 years, Morrison pressed on. But someone took the fake crown from the vault. Was it you? Hayes turned back to Morrison. We had to. Someone else had discovered our secret. They were threatening to expose everything unless we paid them millions of pounds. We couldn't let that happen. Who was threatening you? We don't know. We received anonymous letters for months. Whoever it was knew details that only a Guardian should know. We realized that our secret had been compromised. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So you removed the fake crown to prevent the blackmailer from stealing it and proving that the real crown was missing. Exactly. If they had taken the crown and then revealed it was fake, it would have caused a scandal that could have brought down the monarchy. We had to act first. Morrison leaned back in his chair. The case was more complicated than he had imagined. How many Guardians are there now? 5 of us, Hayes said. The same 5 people you've been questioning. We've all inherited this responsibility from our families. We never wanted to deceive anyone, but we believe we're protecting something more important than any single crown. I need to know where the real crown is. Hayes shook his head. I can't tell you that. Even if you arrest me, I can't break an oath that my family has kept for 70 years. Morrison left the interview more confused than ever. He now understood that the theft was actually an attempt to protect a decades-old secret. But he still didn't know who was blackmailing the Guardians, or where either crown was now located. That afternoon, Morrison received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was disguised, but the words were clear. Stop investigating or I will reveal everything to the newspapers. The royal family will be destroyed. Morrison tried to trace the call, but it came from an untraceable phone. Whoever was behind this was smart and well prepared. They had been watching the investigation closely. Morrison called a meeting with Sir David Williams, the Queen's private secretary. It was time to tell palace leadership what he had discovered. Sir David listened in stunned silence as Morrison explained about Operation Safeguard, the Guardians, and the fake crown. When Morrison finished, Sir David sat quietly for several minutes. My God, Sir David finally said. I've been working here for 40 years, and I never suspected any of this. Are you absolutely certain? The evidence is clear, Morrison replied. The question now is what we do about it. The Guardians are being blackmailed by someone who knows their secret. That person is the real criminal here. Sir David rubbed his temples. This could destroy the royal family's reputation. If people learn that we've been displaying a fake crown for 70 years, they'll never trust us again. Maybe not, Morrison said. Or maybe people will understand that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. The crown was hidden to protect it during a world war. That's not shameful, it's smart. But Morrison knew the situation was dangerous. Somewhere out there, a blackmailer was threatening to expose the Guardians. The fake crown was hidden, and the real crown's location remained a mystery that only 5 people knew. As evening fell over London, Morrison realized that solving this case would require more than just finding missing jewelry. He would have to uncover a conspiracy that had been hidden for 7 decades, find a blackmailer who seemed to know everything about palace secrets, and somehow protect both the royal family and the brave individuals who had spent their lives guarding their most precious treasure. The clock was ticking. Every day that passed brought them closer to a scandal that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Morrison went home that night knowing that tomorrow would bring either a breakthrough in the case or a disaster that would echo through history. In the darkness outside his window, London's lights twinkled like the gems that were hidden somewhere in the city. The real crown was out there, waiting to be found. But first, Morrison had to catch a blackmailer who seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. The game of secrets and lies was far from over. In fact, Morrison suspected that the most dangerous part was just beginning. Detective Morrison woke up early on the 10th day of the investigation with a new idea. The blackmailer knew too much about the Guardians to be an outsider. This had to be someone with access to palace records, someone who could observe the Guardians without being noticed. Morrison returned to the palace archives and asked Mrs. Foster to help him review personnel records from the past 5 years. They looked for anyone who had access to restricted areas but wasn't part of the Guardians. "What about maintenance staff?" Mrs. Foster suggested. "They go everywhere in the palace, often unnoticed." Morrison found the records for maintenance workers who had security clearance for the vault area. One name caught his attention: Michael Stevens, an electrician who had been working at the palace for 3 years. Stevens had access to almost every room in the building for his electrical work. "Mrs. Foster, do you know this man?" She studied the file. "Oh yes, Michael. Very quiet fellow, always polite. But he asks a lot of questions about the history of different rooms. I thought he was just interested in the palace's heritage." Morrison felt a spark of excitement. Stevens would have had opportunities to overhear conversations, to see documents left on desks, to piece together the secret of the Guardians. "Where is he now?" "He should be working in the East Wing today," Mrs. Foster replied. Morrison found Stevens replacing light bulbs in a corridor near the royal apartments. He was a thin man in his 30s with dark hair and careful eyes. When Morrison introduced himself, Stevens seemed nervous but not surprised. "I've been wondering when you'd come to talk to me," Stevens said as he climbed down from his ladder. "Have you? And why is that?" Stevens looked around to make sure they were alone. "Because I know what really happened to the crown. I know about the Guardians, and I know about the blackmail letters." Morrison's pulse quickened. "Did you write those letters?" "No," Stevens said firmly. "But I know who did. That's why I've been waiting for you to find me. I have something to show you." Stevens led Morrison to a small storage room filled with electrical equipment. From behind a panel of switches, he pulled out a wooden box. Inside were photocopies of documents, photographs, and a tape recorder. "I've been investigating this for 2 years. Stevens explained. "My grandfather was Henry Stevens. He worked here during World War II as a security guard. Before he died, he told me about Operation Safeguard and how the real treasures were hidden." Morrison examined the documents. They were copies of the same wartime files he had seen in the archives, plus additional letters and reports that seemed to be missing from the official records. "My grandfather kept these papers his whole life," Stevens continued. "He said that someday someone would need to know the truth. When I got the job here, I started trying to figure out where the real crown was hidden." "And did you find it?" "Yes, but that's not the important part. While I was researching, I discovered that someone else was also investigating the Guardians. Someone with bad intentions." Stevens pressed play on the tape recorder. Morrison heard the sound of a phone conversation. One voice was familiar. It was Professor Hayes. The other voice was cold and threatening. "You have 48 hours to transfer £5 million to the account I specified," the unknown voice said. "If you don't, I will tell the newspapers that the crown jewels are fake. Think about what that will do to the royal family." Morrison listened to more recordings. The blackmailer had been pressuring the Guardians for months, demanding money and threatening to expose their secret. "Who is this person?" Morrison asked Stevens. "That's what took me so long to figure out," Stevens replied. He pulled out a photograph from the box. It showed a man in his 50s entering the palace through a side entrance. "His name is Richard Blackwood. He used to work here as an assistant to the royal historian, but he was fired 5 years ago for trying to steal documents." Morrison studied the photo. Blackwood looked ordinary, the kind of person who could blend into a crowd without being noticed. "How did he find out about the Guardians?" "He never completely left," Stevens explained. "Even after being fired, he had friends among the staff who gave him information. He knew about restricted files, secret meetings, and unusual behavior by the 5 Guardians. He put the pieces together just like you did." Morrison felt the case finally coming together. "Where is Blackwood now?" "That's the problem," Stevens said. 3 days ago, he broke into the palace. I saw him on the security cameras that I monitor for my electrical work. He went straight to the vault area, but by then the Guardians had already removed the fake crown. He didn't find anything. "What did he do then?" Stevens looked worried. "He's been making new threats. He says that if the Guardians don't give him £10 million by tonight, he'll call a press conference tomorrow morning and tell the world that the royal family has been lying for 70 years. Morrison realized that time was running out. "Stevens, I need you to help me catch Blackwood, but first, I need to know where the real crown is." Stevens hesitated. "The Guardians trust me now because I've been helping them track Blackwood. But they made me swear an oath not to reveal the location." "Stevens, this has gone beyond protecting a secret. We're talking about preventing a scandal that could damage the monarchy forever. I need to know." Stevens was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." Stevens led Morrison through a maze of corridors to the basement of the palace. They walked past storage rooms, heating equipment, and old furniture until they reached a wall that looked like all the others. Stevens pressed a hidden switch, and a section of the wall swung open. Behind it was a small room that Morrison hadn't known existed. And there, sitting on a simple wooden table, was the real St. Edward's crown. Morrison stared in amazement. The crown was more beautiful than he had expected. Even in the dim light of the hidden room, the gems sparkled with an inner fire. This was the crown that had been worn by kings and queens for centuries, the symbol of British royalty. "My grandfather helped hide it here in 1943, Stevens said quietly. "The room was built especially for Operation Safeguard. Only the Guardians and their families have known about it since then." Morrison reached out but didn't touch the crown. "It's incredible. But why hasn't it been returned to the vault?" "Because the world has become more dangerous," Stevens replied. "There are terrorists, sophisticated thieves, and people who would do anything to get their hands on something this valuable. The Guardians believe it's safer here, where no one expects to find it." Morrison understood their reasoning, but he also knew that the secret couldn't be kept much longer. "Stevens, we need to end this tonight. Do you know where Blackwood is?" "I think so. He's been staying in a hotel near the palace watching our movements, but he's getting desperate. I'm worried about what he might do." Morrison made a decision. "I'm going to arrest Blackwood tonight, but I need the Guardians' help. Can you arrange a meeting?" An hour later, Morrison sat in a hidden conference room with all 5 Guardians: Professor Hayes, Sarah Chen, Thomas Wright, Lord Pemberton, and Margaret Thompson. Stevens was also present as their unofficial ally. "The situation is critical," Morrison told them. "Blackwood is planning to expose everything tomorrow unless you pay him £10 million. We need to act tonight." Lord Pemberton, the eldest of the Guardians, spoke for the group. "Detective Morrison, our families have protected this secret for 70 years. We cannot let one criminal destroy everything our ancestors worked to preserve. I understand, Morrison replied, but I have a plan that could protect both the secret and the royal family. We're going to give Blackwood what he thinks he wants. Morrison explained his strategy. They would arrange to meet Blackwood and pretend to give him the money he demanded, but instead of cash, they would present him with evidence of his attempted extortion. Morrison's team would be waiting to arrest him. What about the secret? Margaret Thompson asked. If we arrest Blackwood, won't the story come out anyway? Morrison had thought about this carefully. Not necessarily. Blackwood's evidence consists of photographs and recordings that he obtained illegally. If he's arrested for blackmail, his credibility is destroyed. We can then work with palace officials to create a controlled revelation of the truth. Professor Hayes looked puzzled. What do you mean? Instead of letting the story break as a scandal, we reveal it as a heroic tale, Morrison explained. We tell the public that during World War II, brave palace workers risked their lives to protect Britain's treasures from Nazi bombs. We explain that the crown was hidden so well that it took 70 years to safely return it to public view. People will see it as a triumph, not a deception. The Guardians looked at each other. After decades of secrecy, the idea of revealing the truth was frightening but also liberating. It could work, Sarah Chen said slowly. If the story is told properly, people might admire what our families did rather than condemn it. That night, Morrison and his team prepared for the final confrontation. They set up surveillance equipment around the hotel where Blackwood was staying. The plan was to catch him in the act of receiving what he thought was blackmail money. At midnight, Professor Hayes called Blackwood and agreed to meet him in a park near the palace. Morrison's officers were hidden throughout the area, ready to move when given the signal. Blackwood arrived exactly on time, carrying a briefcase and looking nervously around the empty park. Professor Hayes approached him with what appeared to be a bag of money. "Do you have the 10 million?" Blackwood demanded. "I have something better," Professor Hayes replied. "I have the truth." Morrison stepped out of the shadows with his officers. "Richard Blackwood, you are under arrest for attempted extortion." Blackwood tried to run, but the park was surrounded. As the officers handcuffed him, he screamed threats about exposing the royal family. But Morrison knew that without credibility, Blackwood's threats were empty. 3 weeks later, Morrison stood in the renovated royal treasury as officials prepared for a very special ceremony. The real St. Edward's crown sat in its proper place for the first time in 80 years. Beside it was a plaque explaining its wartime journey and the brave people who had protected it. The Queen herself had approved the plan to reveal the truth. In her statement to the press, she praised the Guardians and their families for their decades of faithful service. The story was reported not as a scandal, but as a remarkable tale of devotion and protection. Professor Hayes, Sarah Chen, Thomas Wright, Lord Pemberton, and Margaret Thompson were honored in a private ceremony. Their long secret was finally over, and they could take pride in what their families had accomplished. Stevens was offered a permanent position as an assistant curator, helping to protect the royal treasures he had worked so hard to understand. Mrs. Foster was recognized for her role in preserving the historical records that made the truth possible. As for Blackwood, he was convicted of attempted extortion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His threats to expose the royal family had failed and justice was served. Morrison returned to his regular duties, but he never forgot the case that taught him that sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not by those who steal treasures, but by those who try to destroy the trust and faith that make treasures truly valuable. The crown remains in its vault today, admired by millions of visitors who now know the full story of its incredible journey through history. The real treasure was never just the gold and gems, but the dedication of ordinary people who went to extraordinary lengths to protect something they believed was worth preserving for future generations. In the end, the vault was unlocked not by thieves but by the truth itself. and the crown that was once nowhere to be found had been exactly where it belonged all along, in the hearts and hands of people who loved it enough to sacrifice everything to keep it safe.